The name Genghis Khan often stirs images of fierce warriors on horseback, endless conquests, and the rise of the largest land empire the world had ever seen. His story is told as one of military genius, ruthless ambition, and unmatched power. But behind the clashing swords and burning cities lies a darker truth, one often brushed aside in tales of strategy and empire building. It is a truth that speaks not of victories on the battlefield, but of the silent suffering of those who could not fight back, the women who became victims of his campaigns. To understand what Genghis Khan did with captured women, one must first grasp the world he created. Between the early 13th century and his death in 1227, Genghis and his Mongol warriors swept across Asia, crushing empires from China to Persia. In their wake, cities crumbled, rulers fled or died, and millions perished. But for many women, the fate that awaited was worse than death. They were seen not as people, but as trophies of war, prizes to be divided among warriors or claimed by the Khan himself. Historical records, though fragmented and often written by outsiders, paint a grim picture. Chroniclers from the Islamic world, the Chinese dynasties, and even later Mongol sources mention the systematic taking of women. It was not random. It was part of the machinery of conquest. When Mongol armies stormed a city, the men were often slaughtered. But women and children were gathered, sorted, and distributed. The youngest and most beautiful were reserved for generals or the Khan. Others were handed to soldiers as rewards, while many more were dragged away into servitude, never to see their homes again. Some scholars argue that Genghis Khan's empire was, in part, built on the control of women's bodies. He used marriage alliances to cement loyalty among tribes, forcing noble daughters into unions. But outside of these political strategies, his personal appetite was notorious. Sources suggest that he fathered an astonishing number of children, not through family life, but through domination of captured women. Genetic studies today show that nearly 16 million men across Central Asia share a Y chromosome traceable to Genghis Khan, an unsettling reminder of how conquest left scars, not just in lands but in bloodlines. For the women, there was no choice. They were taken into harems, palaces, and camps. Some were forced into bearing children to strengthen Mongol lineage. Others were passed from one man to another like property. And yet, the silence of their voices in history is deafening. Few left accounts of their pain, most remain nameless, remembered only through the records of those who wrote of the Khan's glory, while ignoring their suffering. This is where the dark history begins. In the shadows of a man celebrated as a conqueror, but feared as a predator. And the question lingers. How far did his power over women reach, and what legacy of cruelty did it leave behind? When the Mongol armies stormed a city, the horror did not end when the last defenders fell. In fact, for women, the worst often began only after the fighting stopped. Survivors of cities like Nishapur, Bukhara, and Samarkand wrote of the same chilling ritual. The warriors set fire to buildings, executed leaders, and then herded women together like cattle. Families were torn apart. Mothers clung to their daughters, knowing what would come next, but there was no mercy. The Mongols divided captives with ruthless efficiency. Higher-ranking commanders selected first, choosing noble women and those considered most beautiful. These women were often taken as concubines or wives, not in ceremonies of love, but in arrangements of force. The Khan himself always had the first pick. And chroniclers whispered that no woman of noble birth, if captured, could escape his claim. His followers believed that by taking royal daughters and noble wives, he weakened enemy bloodlines while strengthening his own. For the common women, their fate was even harsher. Many were handed to soldiers as rewards for bravery in battle. Some were used briefly, then discarded or sold into slavery. Others were forced to march with the Mongol army, carrying supplies by day and enduring abuse by night. Children, too, were not spared. Accounts from Islamic chroniclers describe how young girls were stripped of their families and absorbed into Mongol households. They were raised not as daughters but as servants, some becoming victims of exploitation at a terrifyingly young age. What made this cruelty even more haunting was the system behind it. This was not chaotic looting. It was policy. Genghis Khan understood that controlling women meant controlling future generations. He believed that by fathering children through conquered women, he could leave behind bloodlines loyal to him alone. In his empire, conquest was not just about territory. It was about domination of lineage, where women became tools of both humiliation and expansion. Some women resisted, though their stories are few. A Persian account tells of noble women who chose death rather than capture, leaping into wells or setting fire to themselves to avoid falling into Mongol hands. Others were executed simply for refusing to submit. But for most, survival meant silence. They endured what they could not escape, living as shadows in an empire that celebrated the men who destroyed their world. The Mongols left no written voices from these women. Instead, their suffering is recorded in fragments. Stories told by monks, travelers, and survivors who watched helplessly as their sisters, wives, and daughters vanished into camps. The Mongols themselves did not consider it cruelty. To them, it was the natural right of the conqueror, a right bestowed by power and reinforced by fear. This raises a haunting question. Did Genghis Khan's empire rise on the backs of women as much as on the blades of warriors? And if so, how much of his legacy of power is stained with silence, pain, and forced submission? Behind the walls of Genghis Khan's encampments, a world existed that most of his men never saw. It was the world of his harem, a hidden domain filled with women taken from every corner of his empire. To the outside, these camps were symbols of power. To the women inside, they were prisons dressed in silk. The Khan's harem was not a small collection of wives. It was vast, rivaling the harems of later Ottoman sultans. Historical records suggest that he kept hundreds of women at his disposal, many of them captured from rival rulers, noble families, and conquered cities. His chief wife Bert remained the highest in rank, but even she could not stop the flood of women brought in after every campaign. Each new conquest meant new captives, and many were forced into the harem whether they wished it or not. Inside, women were sorted by status. Those of noble birth were sometimes treated with a measure of respect. But this respect was not freedom, it was survival. They were forced into political marriages, or concubinage, becoming tools for diplomacy. A daughter of a fallen Khan, for example, might be taken as a wife to display dominance over her defeated people. Others, less fortunate, were selected for the Khan's personal use. Life in the harem was cloaked in silence. Women were guarded by eunuchs or loyal retainers, prevented from escape. They were dressed in fine clothes, but the splendor was hollow. Their primary role was to bear children and secure the Khan's lineage. In Mongol culture, children of Genghis Khan, whether born to a wife or a concubine, carried a sacred status. This belief gave him even more reason to father as many offspring as possible. For the women, it meant their bodies were not their own. The genetic legacy of this harem is staggering. Modern DNA studies reveal that nearly 1 in every 200 men alive today carries a white chromosome traceable back to Genghis Khan or his direct descendants. This is not the result of romance or family life. It is the echo of domination, repeated thousands of times across vast territories. Each child born was a reminder of the empire's reach, and each mother was a silent witness to her own captivity. Yet even within this system, fragments of resistance emerged. Some women found ways to influence politics from within, whispering into the ears of sons who would later rise to power. Others sought to protect one another, creating fragile bonds of solidarity in a place designed to break them. But for the majority, their names have been lost, their stories buried beneath the legend of a man celebrated for uniting tribes while tearing apart the lives of countless women. The harem stands as a symbol of the darker side of conquest, a place where power was measured not only by land and armies, but by the number of women who had no choice but to serve one man's will. But this raises another disturbing question. What happened to the women who were not chosen for the Khan's harem? Not every woman taken in conquest was sent to Genghis Khan's harem. For thousands, their lives were determined not by the Khan himself, but by his soldiers. After cities were seized, Mongol warriors lined women up in marketplaces or courtyards, dividing them like spoils of war. It was here that fate took its cruelest turns. Young women of beauty were claimed as concubines or wives for the soldiers. Some were paraded before commanders, chosen as gifts for loyalty or bravery. Others were auctioned off as slaves. Entire caravans of women were marched across the empire, traded like livestock, and forced into households far from their homeland. The Mongol Empire stretched across Asia, and with it, so did the suffering of these captives. A girl taken in Persia might end her days in a household in Mongolia or China, never again hearing her native tongue. But for women deemed less desirable by the conquerors, the elderly, the sick, or those who resisted, the outcome was often death. Sources describe how Mongols slaughtered those they considered of no use, a cold calculation that reveals how little value was placed on human life during these campaigns. The violence was systematic, designed to strip conquered peoples of hope and erase their identity. For those who survived, life was a cycle of servitude. Some were forced into labor, cooking, cleaning, or carrying supplies for Mongol armies on the move. Others were given to allied tribes to secure loyalty, passed from one group of men to another, without a say in their own future. Children born from these unions carried the blood of conquerors, yet many grew up without fathers, as soldiers often moved on to the next campaign. These children, too, became living reminders of domination, their very existence proof of a world where women's choices were erased. What makes this history even more haunting is the silence around it. Unlike rulers who built monuments or wrote chronicles of their lives, the women taken by Mongols left behind almost nothing. They were not seen as worth recording. Their suffering was hidden beneath the glory of conquest, yet we can still trace their presence in fragments. A Persian poem mourning daughters lost, a monk's diary noting the endless sorrow of the women, or the genetic legacy that lingers in millions of men alive today. The Mongols justified these acts through power. To them, women were rewards, signs of victory. To the conquered, they were the heart of their communities. Mothers, daughters, wives, sisters, whose absence left wounds that never healed. Cities rebuilt, but the people within them carried scars that stretched far beyond stone walls. And yet, among all this silence, one question burns. How much of this cruelty came from Genghis Khan himself, and how much was the system he created? Was he simply a warlord following the brutal customs of the steppe, or was he the architect of an empire built on the destruction of women's lives? To understand Genghis Khan's role in the suffering of women, one must look beyond the stories of soldiers and into the structure of his empire. He was not merely a man who allowed cruelty. He institutionalized it. Every conquest, every distribution of captives, every forced marriage or abduction of daughters was part of a larger plan to control, not just land, but people. And women were at the center of that strategy. Steppe traditions before Genghis Khan already included the taking of women as spoils of war. Tribal raids often ended with the capture of wives and daughters. But what Genghis did was different. He elevated this practice to a system of state policy. For him, women were not only prizes, they were tools of diplomacy, power, and legacy. When he forced noble women into marriage, he weakened rival dynasties by absorbing their bloodlines into his own. When he distributed common women among his soldiers, he rewarded loyalty and created dependence, ensuring that his army remained bound to him not just through gold, but through flesh. Chroniclers of the Islamic world were horrified by these practices. Juvaini, a Persian historian, wrote of women dragged into the tents of strangers and of the despair of noble families forced to surrender daughters to the conqueror. In China, records describe how court ladies were stripped of their titles and sent to Mongol camps, their once honored positions erased in an instant. For the Mongols, this was power made visible, to take the wives of emperors, the daughters of kings, and parade them as trophies of the Khan's will. Genghis himself was said to take personal interest in this process. Stories circulated of his demanding that the most beautiful captives be sent directly to him, regardless of their former status. It was whispered that no royal woman was safe once the Khan's army had entered a city. This was not mere lust, it was domination. By taking another ruler's wife or daughter, he declared absolute victory, stripping his enemies not only of their thrones, but of their bloodlines and pride. Yet even as he claimed women for himself, he was careful in how he arranged marriages for his daughters. Unlike the fate of countless other women, Genghis used his daughters strategically, marrying them to powerful allies, but ensuring that they held authority over their husbands' lands. In this we see a contradiction. The same man who condemned thousands of women to lives of servitude granted his daughters power, showing that his treatment of women depended not on respect, but on how useful they were to his empire. For the millions of women caught in his shadow, there was no such privilege. Their lives were reduced to survival, and their silence leaves us with an unsettling thought. Did Genghis Khan truly believe he was building a dynasty of greatness? Or was he simply constructing an empire of fear, with women as bodies as its foundation stones? The power Genghis Khan exercised over captured women did not end with conquest. It lived on in their children. The empire he built was not just political or military, it was biological. Every forced union, every coerced marriage, every child born of captivity was part of a larger vision, a dynasty that would outlive him and stretch across continents. Genetic studies today reveal something astonishing. Nearly 16 million men alive carry a Y chromosome linked back to Genghis Khan and his direct descendants. This is not the result of ordinary family growth. It is the product of a system where women were compelled to bear children of conquerors, whether they wished to or not. Every campaign brought new wives, new concubines, and with them, new heirs. For the women, this meant their bodies were battlegrounds long after the fighting ended. Contemporary chronicles hint at this reality. In Persia, historians noted the rise of children born of the conqueror's will. In China, records mention foreign sons raised in noble houses, their mothers taken in conquest. These children often carried special privileges. Because their father or grandfather was the Khan, they were symbols of dominance, living proof that no kingdom, no family, no bloodline could remain untouched. But this expansion of bloodlines also carried humiliation. For conquered peoples, seeing their noble daughters forced into bearing children for Genghis Khan or his sons was a deep wound. It erased dynasties, diluted identities, and replaced pride with submission. Women who once carried the honor of empires now carried the offspring of their conqueror. Their pain masked by the glorification of Mongol rule. Not all children born of these unions were welcomed. Some were cast aside, growing up in obscurity, reminders of shame for mothers who had no choice. Others were raised as princes and warriors, destined to expand the empire further. The difference lay not in love or family, but in politics. Whether the child could serve the Khan's vision of power, and yet within this dark pattern, contradictions appear. Genghis Khan trusted some of his daughters more than his sons, giving them authority to govern lands and protect frontiers. These daughters ruled with iron hands, commanding armies and securing Mongol dominance. But their power stood in cruel contrast to the countless nameless women whose futures had been stripped away. The empire valued women when they could extend control, and discarded them when they could not. This dual legacy of power and pain, privilege and exploitation, shaped the Mongol world. The children of forced unions carried the Khan's blood, but they also carried the silence of women erased from history. It leaves us to wonder, did Genghis Khan's vision of empire truly rest on loyalty and strategy? Or was it cemented in the suffering of those who never chose to be part of his legacy? For all the chronicles written about Genghis Khan, the campaigns, the battles, the treaties, and the rise of his empire, the voices of the women he captured remain absent. Their suffering is almost invisible in the records, preserved only in whispers from outsiders who witnessed fragments of their fate. It is this silence that makes their story one of history's greatest tragedies. We know the names of generals, sons, and allies, but not the names of the countless women who were taken. The Persian chronicler Juvain mentioned the fall of cities in detail, but when it came to women, his words were brief. They were given to the soldiers, or a single sentence, hiding lives torn apart. Chinese records speak of court ladies sent into Mongol camps, but they describe them not as people, only as offerings. Even European travelers, who wrote of the vastness of the empire, reduced women's stories to mere background notes, shadows behind the greatness of men. Yet the impact of their silence can still be felt. The genetic legacy of Genghis Khan is proof that thousands of women's lives were absorbed into his dynasty. Each child born carried within them a story untold, a story of a mother who never had a choice. These women were the invisible builders of the empire, forced to bear children who would ride with Mongol armies or rule conquered lands. Their names were erased, but their blood shaped history. Some resisted, and their defiance surfaces only in fragments. Accounts tell of women who chose death rather than capture, of noble daughters who burned themselves alive to avoid violation, and of wives who cursed the conquerors before being silenced forever. These stories, though rare, remind us that behind every faceless victim was a human being with dignity, fear, and courage. The Mongols themselves did not see this as cruelty. To them, it was conquest, the natural order of the strong over the weak. Women were considered rewards, resources, or pawns. Their voices were irrelevant in a world built on violence. But for the families left behind, the loss of daughters, wives, and mothers was a wound that generations carried in silence. Communities shattered, not just by massacres, but by the theft of the very people who gave them life. This silence forces us to confront a difficult truth. The story of Genghis Khan is not just about strategy and empire, but about the unrecorded pain of millions of women. Their absence from the historical record is itself a reminder of the power that erased them. They were not considered worth remembering, and yet without them, his empire could not have been built. And so the question lingers. How do we remember a conqueror celebrated as a genius, while acknowledging the hidden cost paid by those who never had a voice? Centuries have passed since the Mongol armies thundered across Asia, but the shadow of their cruelty still lingers. Genghis Khan is remembered in many ways, as a unifier, a strategist, even a nation-builder. Mongolia, he is a national hero, his image printed on currency, his name spoken with pride. But for the women who suffered under his rule, his legacy is not of greatness, but of silence, scars, and survival. The world often remembers empires for their victories, not their victims. Histories are written by rulers, by scholars in their courts, by those who celebrated the rise of power. Rarely are they written by the broken, the enslaved, or the silenced. This is why the stories of captured women remain so faint, because the empire was never interested in preserving their truth. Their suffering was considered irrelevant to the grand tale of conquest, yet modern research forces us to face what earlier historians ignored. The genetic studies proving Genghis Khan's massive biological legacy cannot be explained without acknowledging the forced unions of countless women. The chronicles of conquered cities, though brief, consistently repeat the same image. Women gathered, divided, distributed, and erased. These fragments together create a picture of systemic exploitation, not isolated acts, but a policy that stretched from China to Persia. This raises a moral question. How should we remember a man who shaped history so profoundly? Is he to be praised as a genius of empire, or condemned as an architect of suffering? Perhaps the truth lies in both. The Genghis Khan was not only a master of war, but also a reminder of the darkest costs of human ambition. His greatness cannot be separated from his cruelty, for both were part of the same story. For the women, the empire did not end with the Khan's death in 1227. His successors continued the same practices, seizing women in campaigns across Europe and the Middle East. The cycle of conquest and exploitation endured, spreading pain for generations. Even when the Mongol Empire fractured, the scars it left remained etched into families, lineages, and cultures. The silence of these women is perhaps the loudest voice in this history. We may never know their names, but we know their absence shaped the world. Their stories remind us that behind every empire are those who paid the price unseen and unremembered. And so, as we look at the empire Genghis Khan built, one question stands above all. Can any achievement, no matter how vast, erase the memory of the lives broken to create it? History often celebrates Genghis Khan as the man who built the largest contiguous empire the world has ever known. His military strategies are studied in academies, his leadership praised for uniting the fractured tribes of the steppe. But when we strip away the legends, what remains is not just the story of conquest, but also of cruelty, especially toward women who had no voice in the chronicles of power. The fate of captured women reveals a truth rarely told, that the Mongol Empire was not only built on horseback and blood, but also on the silent suffering of millions. For noble women, their dignity was stripped as they became pawns of political unions, concubines for generals, or possessions for the Khan himself. For common women, their lives were shattered, reduced to slavery, servitude, or worse. Their stories were not recorded in grand epics or carved into monuments. They were deliberately erased because the victors saw no value in preserving their pain. And yet their absence speaks louder than any record, forces us to confront the human cost of empire. To remember that greatness in history often comes at a price carried by those who could not resist. The genetic legacy of Genghis Khan, Millions of men today carrying his bloodline is not a mark of glory, but a haunting reminder of domination repeated across generations. Each life taken, each child born of force, each voice silenced, is a piece of that legacy. For the Mongols, this was seen as victory. For the rest of the world, it was tragedy. But for the women themselves, it was survival. Some endured, raising children who would shape history. Some resisted, leaving behind whispers of defiance. Others disappeared into silence, their stories lost forever. They were the invisible backbone of the empire, unwilling participants in a dynasty built through their suffering. Today, when we look back at Genghis Khan, we cannot tell his story without them. His empire may have redrawn maps, destroyed dynasties, and changed the course of civilizations, but beneath the surface lies the hidden cost, the lives of women who were never given a choice. To forget them is to tell only half the story. This is the true dark history, not just of battles and bloodshed, but of the women erased from memory. Their silence is the shadow that still follows Genghis Khan's name. A reminder that power often thrives by burying the pain of those it crushes. So when we ask, what did Genghis Khan do with captured women? The answer is not found in glory, but in grief. And the greatest lesson is this: no empire, no matter how vast, can escape the weight of the forgotten lives upon which it was built.